The story began with the protagonist who had been betrayed by his friends. They sealed him away with countless monsters intending for him to die. On the brink of death, the protagonist cast a reincarnation spell and awakened 20 years later in a high school. He found himself in the body of an academy boy who possessed the void attribute considered the strongest. Determined, he vowed to take revenge on his former friends. The story unfolded from that day. Suddenly, dungeon gates appeared and monsters started pouring out. Only those who had awakened magical abilities could stop them. Among them were two fighters battling the monsters, Claudia Berg and Ingolf von Dietz. Others included Nathaniel Cavell and Awaki. A girl named Liruoki was also among the awakened, all fighting valiantly against the monsters. Amidst the chaos, a civilian screamed for help as a monster approached. Ingolf urged Claudia to hurry and help the victims. With an indifferent expression, Claudia commented that they were simply too far away. At that critical moment, a giant monster threatened a trembling civilian, but someone intervened, delivering a powerful kick to the monster and sending it flying. After an explosive impact and falling debris, a man stood in front of the citizens and asked if everyone was all right. He promised to take care of the threat, and it was revealed that this man was the protagonist, Masato Kakeiro. He charged at the monster with a glowing hand, yellow light shining in his eyes. In a flash, he moved through the horde, killing every monster with precision and striking a heroic pose. Observing him, the other awakened individuals were in awe, remarking on how incredible he was to face so many alone. Roxy noted that with his time magic attribute, he could see the future and anticipate every move the monsters made. To her, he no longer seemed human. While the others whispered among themselves, the protagonist continued eliminating monsters. After defeating nearly all the creatures, only one remained. He delivered the final blow, declaring it the last one. With determination, he stated that he would protect the peace and began sealing the gate from which the monsters emerged. But just then he was attacked from behind. His expression turned to shock as he put distance between himself and the attacker. Suddenly, he was pulled into the portal due to the ambush. From the other side, he saw the party members watching him and noticed a seal forming on the portal. Confused, he questioned what was happening, admitting he had never foreseen such a future. He wondered if everyone was part of the betrayal. From within the portal, he asked them why they would do this. Nathaniel grinned and replied that the very reason he was unaware was why he had been betrayed. The rest of the party members smiled evil. Rio told him that he was a level 100 monster who could use time attribute magic. Claudia added that they just wanted to earn money safely. Ingolf sneered, accusing the protagonist of putting them in danger simply because he wanted to help people. Iwako echoed this sentiment, blaming him for leading them into such peril. Nathaniel declared that it would be the last time they ever saw him. As they turned away, the protagonist banged on the portal, shouting in disbelief and demanding to be released. He reflected on their betrayal and recalled his memories as the leader of the Golden Seekers. He had tried to protect the world and everyone in it. Anger and disbelief overtook him as he shouted, wondering why they had betrayed him. At that moment, a swarm of monsters lunged at him, though he swiftly dealt with one. He was horrified to see an entire army of monsters waiting to kill him. He activated his future vision and attempted to foresee a way out. He thought he could escape, but the only future he saw was his death at the hands of the monsters. Smiling grimly, he realized that the future he once had no longer existed. Surrounded, he charged with a glowing yellow fist, his body enveloped in a powerful aura. After a fierce battle, he knelt in a pool of his own blood. He admitted that he couldn't change the future. Looking up at the monsters, he accepted that he might have no choice but to face death. The monsters began to swarm him. But just then he was hurled into the air. Refusing to die like that, yellow energy swelled within him. He vowed to reincarnate, reach the peak of his strength, and take revenge on those who betrayed him. The same energy glowed in his eyes. Overwhelmed by rage and despair, he swore to avenge his regrets. Yellow energy swirled around him, and a beam of light shot from his hand as pain from the monsters. Attacks consumed him. Suddenly, a glimmer of yellow light appeared, and the next moment, someone woke up. The attire suggested the person was in a hospital. Dressed in hospital clothes, he walked toward a mirror and upon seeing his reflection confirmed that the reincarnation had worked. It was the protagonist. He looked around and realized he was in a hospital, unfamiliar machines surrounding him. He wondered how many years had passed. If 100 years had gone by, his chance for revenge might have vanished. He imagined the faces of those who betrayed him. At that moment, he noticed something on the table, a student ID. Upon inspecting it, he realized that 20 years had passed since his betrayal. But one detail on the ID shocked him. The body's attribute was void at level 1. Recognizing the attribute, he laughed maniacally. He remembered being feared for his time attribute in his previous life. But as he grew stronger, he realized he had reached a limit. Even his clairvoyance couldn't reveal the full extent of the void attribute's power. He pied the original owner of the body. The void attribute was undoubtedly the strongest. Yet it was so rare that no one in his previous life knew how to train it. That was why the body's original owner remained at level 1. He wondered if the boy had been mocked for having no attribute perhaps many times. He assured the boy that he would make his name known throughout the world as one of the strongest adventurers. Thanks to his clairvoyance, the protagonist knew how to train the void attribute. With this power, he vowed to become the absolute strongest and make those traitors pay. The protagonist continued contemplating, expressing that in order to get revenge on the traitors, he needed to level up first. He then lay down on the hospital bed with his eyes closed. He thought about the void attribute, recognizing that as the name suggested, it was related to magic. To control nihility, he imagined a void where shining blue square structures existed. He continued thinking that the essence of this attribute lay in the ability to freely project one's imagination into reality. He reflected that while everyone could imagine things, turning those thoughts into reality was the true challenge. He visualized someone thinking of a sculpture, yet finding it very difficult to draw. He considered that it was fortunate this body was badly injured. For if he could apply the image in his mind to the body, he might heal. He began visualizing every single cell being restored by magic. At that very moment, all the wounds on his body began to disappear and heal. Clenching his hand, he noted with satisfaction that it had worked. Rubbing the area where the wound had been, he thought that since it was only rudimentary casting, the recovery speed wasn't impressive. His insides weren't fully healed, but by using the magic multiple times, he could increase its level. He understood that the ability to convert imagination into reality would improve with practice, expanding the range of images he could bring to life. This progression, he thought, would allow the creation and usage of many different kinds of magic. Eventually, the image in his mind could be realized exactly as he envisioned it in reality. A glint of a smile appeared on his face. At that moment, a doctor entered his hospital room, saying he was finally awake. The doctor rushed toward him, advising him not to move just yet since he had sustained serious injuries from a monster attack. The protagonist reflected on what had happened and realized the original owner of this body had been attacked. The doctor, smiling, commented that despite such dire circumstances, the protagonist had woken up. He added that it was almost as if the saintess had bestowed a miracle upon him. The protagonist questioned what he meant by saintess. The doctor, surprised, asked if he didn't know. The protagonist shook his head and replied that he didn't. The doctor began explaining about the saintest of the pentagram saints. However, the protagonist remained clueless and admitted he didn't know who the pentagram saints were either. Thinking aloud, the doctor concluded that since the protagonist had only just regained consciousness, it was natural he was confused. He stated that a thorough examination was in order and left to prepare everything needed, telling the protagonist to wait there. Once the doctor had left, the protagonist thought about the saints and the pentagram saints. He reflected that they must be one of the clans or adventurers who had emerged in the 20 years during his absence. He got out of bed and approached a TV remote, acknowledging that while leveling up was important, he also needed to understand the current state of the world. He turned on the TV, which began broadcasting a special segment about the SSS-class dungeon disaster from 20 years ago. Upon seeing this, he thought it was perfect, a special on the incident where he was betrayed. The news report continued, revealing that the SSS-class dungeon disaster had been caused by the culprit whose name the protagonist waited to hear. The report named the culprit as the leader of the Golden Seeker, a level 10-time attribute user, Misato Koiro, who was none other than the protagonist himself. He stood up in shock. Watching the TV, he thought in disbelief that he was the culprit. He wondered what that could possibly mean. The news explained further that Misato Kokairo had predicted the future disaster, but had not informed anyone. Instead, he planned to use the chaos to rule the world. The other members of the Golden Seeker prevented this and were now hailed as the great heroes known as the Pentagram Saints. After a fierce battle, Misato was defeated and the dungeon sealed successfully, a feat known by all. Even now, the Pentagram Saints were said to lead the world in various areas. As the broadcast prepared to invite experts, the protagonist turned the TV off. Laughing while covering his face, he expressed that not only had they betrayed him, they had dragged his dignity through the mud. They had sacrificed him and shamelessly reaped the rewards now celebrated as so-called heroes. Clenching the remote tightly, he declared he would never forgive them. With a menacing expression, he vowed to send all of them to hell. A few moments later, after calming down, he thought about the need to remain undetected by their radar. At that moment, he recalled that the original owner of the body attended an academy. Picking up a phone and looking at the screen, he confirmed his suspicion. The body's original owner was connected to the headmaster of the Takigo Adventure Training Academy. The academy was led by none other than Awako Hideki, one of those who had betrayed him. Clenching the phone, he thought it was incredibly fortunate to immediately know the location of one of them. Sitting down on the hospital bed, he acknowledged that Awako was a cautious man who wouldn't show weakness easily. He noticed a student ID card and reflected on the vast difference in level between himself and Awako. Defeating him now would be impossible. Lying down and gazing at the ceiling while stretching out his hand, he realized he couldn't do anything at level 1. For now, he resolved to level up and search for Awako. With determination in his eyes, he clenched his fist and declared that Awako would be his first target. A few weeks later, the scene shifted. The protagonist, now fully healed, looked at himself in the mirror, thinking that he could finally move without issues. The doctor entered the room, expressing disbelief that he had made a full recovery in just a week. As the protagonist changed into the academy uniform, the doctor continued to wonder aloud if this could be a blessing from the saints. Perfecting his tie, the protagonist responded that it was. He believed everything was thanks to his own power. Leaving the hospital room, he thanked the doctor for taking care of him. The doctor advised him to take care from now on. Outside the hospital, the protagonist stated that he had completed the bare-bone preparations. He considered his current level sufficient and proposed to himself that it was time to warm up by heading to a dungeon. The protagonist explained that he had heard from the doctor that the entire family of the original owner of the body had died in an accident. While walking on the street, he expressed feeling sorry for the original owner of the body. However, as he closed his eyes, he thought that it was a good thing for him as it meant he could do what he wanted. He then approached the dungeon portal, looking at his phone where a map was open. He wondered if this was the place and putting on a mask, thought about leveling up and growing stronger. He wanted to try things out there. Fully equipped with a mask and hoodie, he approached the reception where a guard looked at him. He showed his ID to the guard. At that moment, the guard held the protagonist's hand and called out to him. The protagonist asked what it was, and the guard informed him that he was only level 27. The guard explained that adventurers needed to be at least level 30 to form parties and enter the dungeon. Shouting, the guard questioned if he planned to enter alone, calling it practically suicide. The protagonist calmly responded that the guard's concerns might be valid in normal cases. He then swapped his hand from the guard's grasp and with a menacing expression declared that he was a student of the Takigo Adventure Training Academy. He stated that as long as he signed the consent form, it should be fine, asking if he was right. He reminisced that he had looked into this rule while he was in the hospital. The guard acknowledged that he was right. But before he could say more, someone called out to the protagonist, telling him that it was enough already. 3 boys were seen standing near a tree. One of them, a golden-haired boy, said that the guard was just saying that because he was worried about him. The golden-haired boy clarified that the guard's warning was out of concern. Another boy in the middle accused the protagonist of being a greenhorn and told him to know his place. Ignoring them, the protagonist asked the guard if he just needed to sign there, pointing toward the digital tablet on the reception. He signed the consent form, but the guard wanted him to wait. However, the protagonist walked away, saying there shouldn't be any other issue now and asking if that was right. The guard simply watched as the protagonist headed toward the dungeon portal. The protagonist thanked him, expressing gratitude for his concern. The guard then turned to the 3 boys under the tree, asking them to follow the protagonist. He stated that letting him go alone was suicide. One of the boys sneered upon hearing this and questioned why they should follow him. The purple-haired boy remarked that it might actually be a good thing. He added that if no one was watching, then even if something happened, it wouldn't be a problem. His expression turned serious and evil as he asked if he was wrong. The 3 boys then started approaching the dungeon portal, acting tough. One of them scoffed that the protagonist needed another 100 years before he could do anything. The guard waved at them, apologized for the bother, and said he was counting on them. Inside the dungeon, the 3 boys walked together. The purple-haired boy suggested they do what they usually do. The golden-haired boy agreed, mentioning killing the kid and blaming it on the monsters. One of the boys commented that it was thanks to such idiots that their pockets got fuller. 10 minutes later, they were still running through the dungeon. The purple-haired boy noted that it had been a straight road so far. The golden-haired boy said they hadn't caught up to the kid yet. Just then, the golden-haired boy pointed out something, saying they had finally caught up. They saw the protagonist standing in front of a horde of monsters releasing a menacing aura. With a single slash of fire, he killed a monster. He then used another attack, a green wind swirling around his hand, which he shot at the monsters. The green wind pushed the fire attack forward, and as a result, all the monsters were reduced to ashes in an instant. The group of boys watched in shock. The purple-haired boy exclaimed in disbelief. Another boy remarked that the protagonist had completely annihilated deer-rank monsters by himself. The golden-haired boy pointed out a rare item drop, a bag of crystals. All the boys' faces turned greedy as they thought about selling it and living comfortably for the next 6 months. Believing the protagonist hadn't noticed them, they observed him picking up the loot dropped by the monsters. They mocked him as an idiot and planned to kill him to take the rare item. All 3 boys dashed toward the protagonist, signaling each other. The purple-haired boy commanded them to kill him. One boy unleashed a blue old attack, and the golden-haired boy launched a green attack at the protagonist. The protagonist pulled down his mask and with a menacing expression scolded them for thinking they were being slick. He dodged all the attacks and remarked that no matter the era, there were always people trying to take what belonged to someone else. The golden-haired boy and the boy in the red jacket were shocked, questioning if the protagonist had eyes on his back. As the purple-haired boy charged with a fire attack, shouting for the protagonist to die, the protagonist simply turned slightly, clenched his fist, and punched him in the gut. The punch was so powerful that blood spurted from the purple-haired boy's mouth, and he was thrown far away. Turning away, the protagonist declared that he would crush vermin like them without mercy. He said he would use them as stepping stones without hesitation for the sake of his revenge, which had now begun. A blue aura began glowing around him. The scene shifted to outside the dungeon portal. Inside the dungeon, someone stepped forward and began walking. A boy folded his arms, and it was shown that he had arrived after hearing that a student from the academy had entered a dungeon alone. This boy was introduced as Yoi Tsudai, one of Awako's subordinates. Yoi continued looking at the 3 unconscious boys lying on the ground. He questioned why novice hunter adventurers were lying dead, and wondered aloud about what could have happened there. The scene transitioned to night, showing a building where the protagonist was seated. He stated that in the D-rank dungeon, he had managed to level up and test out void magic. Looking at a student ID, the protagonist revealed that his new spell was Info Obscurity. He smiled and noted that the spell not only allowed him to fake his levels, but also erased dungeon entry records. He acknowledged the usefulness of this skill, mentioning how he had used it to manipulate the security guard. The protagonist lay on his bed looking at his phone and remarking that tomorrow would be his first day at the academy. While scrolling, he noticed some hateful messages directed at him. Someone had demanded cash, saying, "Cough up the cash already," while another message told him to get your head out. Upon seeing these messages, the protagonist understood the situation, thinking, so that's how it is. The next day, the scene shifted to the academy. The protagonist was walking when a cute girl greeted him with a cheerful good morning, asking if he was feeling better. Now she was introduced as Asahi Karin. The protagonist thanked her and said he was fine now. Asahi responded that she was glad because she had been really worried. Observing her, the protagonist reflected that the original owner of the body must have had people who cared for him. Just then, someone else called out to the protagonist, mocking him as the no attribute who had barely escaped death. 3 boys approached, and the leader claimed that since he was protecting a weak level 1 like the protagonist, he deserved something in return. He grinned evilly and demanded money, saying he was short on cash and assumed the protagonist had brought it. The protagonist remembered the messages from the previous night and realized these were the culprits. At that moment, Asahi intervened, telling them to stop because the protagonist had just been discharged from the hospital. However, the protagonist noticed her trembling hand as she stood up to the bullies. Stepping forward and shielding Asa, he thanked her, but said he would be fine. The boys laughed, one commenting that the words were bold for someone with no attribute. Another warned him not to act tough just because he was in front of a girl. The leader of the group reminded the protagonist that he was a useless nobody who couldn't even use magic. He cracked his hands ready to fight, but the protagonist responded that it was the bullies who needed a reminder of their place. Unlike them, he claimed he was someone who kept his word. He recalled the promise he had made to the original owner's body to make his name known throughout the world. The protagonist signaled the bullies to come at him, which angered the leader. The leader asked what nonsense the protagonist was spouting and began charging a fire spell. Swirling flames gathered around his hand. Asahi warned that using magic outside the dungeon was against school rules, but the leader shouted at her to shut up, blaming the talentless piece of bull for trying to defy him. He then launched the fire attack at the protagonist. The protagonist stood still and watched the incoming attack. At that moment, he used his void attribute magic to replicate the leader's fire magic and unleashed an even bigger fire attack. The 2 fire spells collided with the protagonist's attack, clearly overpowering the other. An explosion followed as the spells clashed. The two remaining bullies were shocked. One exclaimed that the protagonist had used the same magic while the other questioned how long he had been capable of it. The protagonist then taunted the leader, asking if that was all he had. The leader twitched and ordered the other two bullies to attack. They obeyed, launching a water attack and a wind attack while asking how the protagonist liked that. But the protagonist countered by replicating both spells, water in one hand and wind in the other, and hurled them back at the bullies, successfully neutralizing the attacks. The leader was stunned and questioned what was happening. One of the bullies wondered aloud how many attributes the protagonist could use, while another said he had never heard of such a thing. The protagonist's voice echoed as he asked if they were satisfied. He declared it was his turn now, and walking toward the bullies assured them he wouldn't kill them at least. Flames surged from his hands, terrifying the bullies who turned and fled. The protagonist then addressed the leader, asking whether the original owner of the body hadn't asked them for help before. Without waiting for an answer, he said he didn't need to hear it. Staring menacingly at the leader, the protagonist grabbed his mouth and began tightening his grip. He remarked that vermin like the leader always spouted the same things. So no matter what he said, it wouldn't stop his fist. As tears welled up in the bully's eyes, the protagonist, his fist brimming with flames, delivered a powerful punch to the leader's face. The force sent the bully flying, his face wrecked and smoke rising from his body. Asahi called out the protagonist's name. He quietly resolved to himself that no one would ever look down on him again. From now on, he said, they would walk the path to becoming the strongest adventurer together. The scene shifted as the bullies were seen apologizing to the protagonist. Two underlings of the bully leader were carrying him, apologizing. The leader of the bullies cursed under his breath, admitting that the protagonist had completely changed after being discharged from the hospital. At that moment, the protagonist commented that in the end, the leader wasn't all that strong. Behind him stood Asa. The protagonist and Asahi were seen walking through the academy's lobby. Many students were watching the protagonist, causing him to wonder if he had stood out too much. As the protagonist was about to enter the classroom amidst the crowd, someone called out to him, asking him to wait a moment. Turning back, it was revealed to be the same boy from the dungeon, who then asked if the protagonist had some time. The protagonist, thinking the boy looked like an upperclassman and feeling it was a hassle, considered brushing him off. He apologized, saying class was about to start and he needed to leave. The boy then mentioned he hadn't yet introduced himself. He revealed his name to be Yoitsudai, leader of Biting the Cat. Asahi echoed the name, surprised. Upon hearing this, the protagonist stopped in his tracks, recognizing the clan name as the one created by Principal Iwako. The boy continued, asking once again if the protagonist could spare some time. The protagonist, looking back, said that if that was the case, it couldn't be helped. After a moment, Yoichi got straight to the point, asking whether the protagonist was the one who had defeated the adventurers found in the Duran dungeon the previous night. The protagonist questioned what he was talking about, internally wondering how Yui had discovered something that was supposed to be kept secret. Yoi explained that he had been told a student entered the dungeon, so he investigated. Inside, he found infamous criminals known as hunting novices. Additionally, he noted that the protagonist had used multi-attribute magic that morning. With a menacing glare, Yoichi waited for an answer. The protagonist smiled, thinking that Yoi didn't know the specifics of his magic. Snapping his fingers, Yui demanded the truth, asking once again if the protagonist had defeated them. The protagonist rummaged through his school bag and claimed he didn't remember what happened since he had been attacked suddenly that morning. Taking out his student ID, he stated he was really just a level 1, and therefore couldn't have done something like that. He then showed the ID to Yoichi. Upon inspecting it, Yoi noted that the ID confirmed the protagonist was level 1 and had the void attribute. Feeling deceived, he thought this nobody dared to waste his time. Angry, Yoi turned away, apologizing for calling the protagonist over. He warned him not to act suspiciously in the future as it caused extra work. Yoi left the classroom watching him go. The protagonist thought about how Yoi might be useful. With a grin, he considered the possibility of using Yoichi to approach Akko without raising suspicion. He wondered if there was a way to make Yoi his pawn. Then the idea struck him. This could be the perfect time to test out a certain magic. An evil smile formed on his face. The scene shifted to Yoichi reporting to Principal Iwako, concluding his report about the events in the D-rank dungeon the previous night. Principal Iwako remarked that it wasn't like Yoi to screw up. A glimpse of the principal revealed a slightly middle-aged man with many brightly shining rings on his hands. The principal reminded Yoi to be careful when choosing who to use. Yoi bowed and apologized sincerely, promising to calm the situation right away. Principal Iwako rose from his seat, asserting that it was only natural. Walking toward Yoichi, He warned that if it became known Yoichi was involved with hunting novices, he too would be criticized. Grabbing Yoichi's face and lifting it with a menacing glare, the principal warned him not to forget that even he could be discarded in a heartbeat if something went wrong. Terrified, Yoichi bowed deeply and expressed his understanding. But as he bowed, anger bubbled within him. Gritting his teeth, he cursed his situation, thinking that if he had known it would come to this, he would have extorted more money from those idiotic hunters. The principal then said there was one thing he still didn't understand. Raising his head, Yoi asked what it was. Holding a tablet, Principal Awak explained that according to the report, the student in question was at least a third year. However, no third-year student had entered a dungeon the previous night. Placing the tablet back, he concluded that the adventurers must have been defeated by a monster while hunting novices, and that Yoichi was lying to cover it up. Looking out the window, Yako said it was more realistic to think that way than to believe one of his own students had defeated novice hunters alone. Yoi responded with a questioning tone, and Io affirmed it, stating that unless something extremely unusual had happened, that was the most plausible conclusion. Just then, Yoi recalled the protagonist, noting to himself that he was a bit unusual. Addressing the principal, Yoichi suggested whether it was possible that a unique attribute had been involved. The principal, slightly turning his head toward Yoichi, acknowledged that it was certainly a possibility. At that moment, Yoi grinned, placing a hand on his chest, and requested that Principal Awako leave the matter to him. He vowed to resolve the issue swiftly, his face displaying a menacing expression. The scene transitioned to the dungeon where the flicker of a fire torch lit up the surroundings. Many students from Awako Academy were seen using their magic to fire at something. Their target was a monster, and their spells were aimed to bring it down. A monkey-like monster clung to the wall. One of the students exclaimed that it had come this way, prompting many of them to flee in fear as the creature roared. Just then, someone began gathering magic power in his hand. A golden swirl of magical light was directed at the monkey-like monster, killing it instantly. The lifeless body of the monster hit the ground, and the other students stared in awe. The one responsible was none other than Yoichi. Yoi instructed the students not to break formation. From within the crowd, a student remarked that Yoichi was amazing, noting that he had been chosen by Principal Awako. Another green-haired student mused about possibly joining the Biting the Cat clan as well. Having defeated multiple monsters, Yoi declared that he had cleared the area. Senior students saluted him, acknowledging his efforts. He then told them that he would leave the rest of them, to which they all responded in unison with an understood. Internally, Yoi thought to himself that it was time to do what he came for. He reached beneath his school uniform and retrieved an artifact. He addressed the artifact, commanding it to reveal the protagonist's location. In response, the chains within the artifact came to life, swirling with a blue aura. They shot off rapidly, pulling Yoichi in the direction of the protagonist. Yoi noted that as he suspected the protagonist was far from the other students, he reflected that whatever the protagonist was planning, it was better for him this way. With a menacing laugh, he concluded that it would appear the protagonist's death was just an unfortunate accident, as he would simply claim to have found Asaki dead along the way, something not uncommon in dungeons. He began plotting to kill the protagonist, his expression twisted with malice. He recalled the novice hunter incident and how trouble had seemed to follow ever since the protagonist was discharged from the hospital. Yoi was also deeply curious about the conversation he had overheard earlier. The narrative shifted to moments earlier. Yoi was seated at a table while the bullies knelt before him. He questioned them, asking if what they said was true. In a panic, the bullies insisted it was. They pleaded with him to believe them, saying that the no-attribute boy had attacked them using the exact same magic they had used. The golden-haired bully added that the boy had created an enormous flame unlike anything he had seen before. Yoi expressed disbelief, stating he couldn't accept such claims. Having asked what he needed, he gave an order to his lackeys in a threatening tone, telling them to educate the bullies. He declared he had no use for weaklings who lost to incompetence. As his lackey seized the bullies, the leader protested, saying that wasn't what Yoichi had promised. Ignoring the protests, Yoichi walked away. One of the bullies tried again, calling out that what was happening wasn't what had been promised. Suddenly, another bully pointed behind Yoichi, prompting the green-haired one to comment with a horrified expression that the protagonist had already ceased to be human. Back in the present, Yoichi continued following the chains, which were guiding him toward the protagonist's location. He thought about the green-haired bully's expression and concluded that the fear he had shown was unnatural. Just to be certain, Yoichi had sent the protagonist to a special class hosted by the Biting the Cat clan, but all he had shown there were powerful illusions. Yoi suspected the protagonist must have used a magic item or some trick to defeat the novice hunters. He chuckled to himself. As he walked through the dungeon, he noticed the corpse of a monster and wondered if it had been the protagonist's doing. It seemed to have been killed with a single fire attack. He sneered, realizing that the rumors weren't entirely false, but scoffing at the power, claiming even Iwako, the pentagram dropout, could do that. He acknowledged that for now he had no choice but to obey, but vowed to one day surpass Iwako and rule the world as a pentagram. He imagined himself as a king and laughed evilly. He knew, however, that to achieve that no one could find out about his connection to the novice hunter killings and the looting of their corpses. As for the protagonist, who was bound to cause more trouble, Yoi resolved to ensure that a little unfortunate accident would occur in the dungeon. He figured the protagonist had to be just around the corner. The chains continued to guide him, and eventually he reached a corner and peeked around it. What he saw made his eyes widen. The protagonist was sitting atop a pile of monster corpses fashioned like a throne exuding an ominous aura. The protagonist addressed him, saying he was awfully late and that he had grown tired of waiting. Yoi panicked, thinking that his presence should have been completely concealed. He couldn't understand how the protagonist had sensed him, but the protagonist continued, noting aloud that Yoi must be wondering how he could sense his presence. Yoi was stunned, thinking that his thoughts had been read. Stepping out from the corner, Yoichi demanded to know what the protagonist was. The protagonist casually remarked that he had heard AKO had chosen Yoichi, but found him to be far less impressive than expected. He added that Yoichi's actions, hunting down novices and extorting money, were cowardly, just like AKO. Irritated, Yoi demanded to know how the protagonist knew that. The protagonist addressed him again, stating that Yui seemed to enjoy tormenting others, but had never experienced what it felt like to be haunted. Raising his hand and clenching it into a fist, the protagonist declared that he would now teach Yoi that very feeling. He concluded that with magic, he would make Yoichi dance his confidence unmistakable. Yoi called the protagonist a dangerous bastard and claimed he was far too dangerous. His irritated expression lingered as he glared at the protagonist. At that moment, Yoi drew his sword, which gleamed with a yellow aura. He declared that for the sake of his ambition, he would defeat the protagonist at all costs. He lunged forward, slashing toward him. The protagonist, however, simply leapt backward, dodging the attack while gathering fire magic in his hand. He questioned if that was Yoichi's true strength. Holding the fiery spell toward Yoichi, he prepared to strike. Yoi effortlessly sliced through the fireball, dissipating it with one swing of his sword. He scoffed at the protagonist's skill level, mocking him for thinking such magic could defeat him. However, he failed to notice another magic attack approaching. At the last second, Yoichi saw the incoming spell and shielded himself with his sword. The magic collided with his blade, forcing him backward with sheer impact. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled as the surrounding stones transformed into spikes. Shocked, Yoichi watched as the spikes surged toward him. Yet with a flurry of sword slashes, he cut them down into bits. He cursed the protagonist's ability to use multi-attribute magic. Demanding answers, Yoichi asked about the protagonist's void. But before he could finish, the protagonist appeared behind him, sword drawn and eyes full of menace. Yoi barely reacted in time to block the attack. Their blades collided, and Yoi cursed under his breath, accusing the protagonist of interfering with his plans. The clash of swords sent both of them retreating from the force. The protagonist questioned Yoichi's plans, prompting Yoichi to declare his intent to surpass Akko and take his place as a pentagram saint. In response, the protagonist asked why he targeted Iwako specifically, noting there were other pentagram saints. With a twisted smirk, Yoichi explained that he chose Iwako because he was a dropout. Laughing maniacally, Yoichi said that by becoming a pentagram saint, he would gain the right to rule the book, and targeting the weakest made strategic sense. The protagonist, upon hearing such ambition, sighed in disappointment and called him despicable. Yoi demanded clarification, and the protagonist revealed he had initially feared Yoichi might reach Iwako first. But now, knowing his pathetic goals, the protagonist admitted there was no reason to worry. Infuriated, Yoi snapped and charged at the protagonist, hurling insults and slashing wildly with his sword. He screamed about his desires for power, money, and women. The protagonist defended calmly, blocking each blow. Yoi shouted that he craved power that allowed him to trample others without consequence. Their swords clashed again with intense force. Yoi exclaimed that as a pentagram saint he could do whatever he pleased. He declared he would uncover the saintess's weakness and make her his. Imagining himself wrapped around her, the protagonist, disgusted, stated that Yoichi's words were no longer worth listening to and that it was time to end things. With a powerful slash, the protagonist sent Yoi flying, shattering his sword in the process. Sword fragments scattered through the air. Yoi screamed in disbelief over his broken weapon. Walking toward him, The protagonist remarked that Yoichi's endless rambling had bought him enough time to complete his preparations. As the sword in the protagonist's hand vanished, multicolored lights shimmered behind him. Yoi, terrified, begged him not to come closer. The protagonist stared at him intently and told him to dance. His pupils glowed purple as he activated absolute hypnosis. The magic enthralled Yoichi, fully immersing him. As the spell completed, Yoichi collapsed. The protagonist observed Yoi lying on the ground and thought that absolute hypnosis required breaking the target spirit before activation. He commanded Yoi to stand. Yoi's hand twitched and he stood up in a lifeless state, replying, "Yes, sir, I have stood up." The protagonist noted to himself that the spell had worked. He instructed Yoichi to focus on completing the mission and promised further commands later. Yoi nodded and responded with understanding. Noticing Yoichi's unnatural tone, the protagonist told him to return to his usual manner of speaking. Yoichi's tone normalized as he stated he would resume leading the group and then departed. Satisfied with the result, the protagonist smiled. As he walked through the dungeon, a shadow emerged. Karen appeared, calling out to him and expressing her worry. Smiling, the protagonist apologized, explaining he had been speaking with Yoichi. Karen questioned the topic of their conversation. The protagonist replied that they had discussed how to make her dreams come true. Curious, Karen asked if he had received good advice. He confirmed he had, and added that one of his dreams would now certainly come true. Karen smiled warmly, wishing for his dream to come true soon. He responded with agreement. At that moment, Yoichi's voice rang out from behind, announcing the Special Class S impending victory and instructing all students to gather. Karen urged the protagonist to hurry so they wouldn't fall behind. As they walked, the protagonist reflected that he was glad to have joined the class, as he had finally secured a pawn of Iwako's, one Akko would never suspect. The scene transitioned to Akko, who was seen speaking with Yoichi and questioning him about the progress regarding the novice hunter incident. Yoi replied affirmatively and stated that, as expected, a student possessing a unique attribute was involved. He handed a digital tablet to Awako, who looked at the image of the protagonist displayed on it. Yoi explained that the student had been held captive at the usual location and was being interrogated. He had admitted to using multi-attribute magic to defeat the novice hunters. Startled by this revelation, Akko repeated the words multi-attribute magic in disbelief and asked what that meant. With a smirk on his face, Yoi responded that the specifics were currently unknown, but requested more time to uncover the details. Changing the topic, he suggested that it had been a while and proposed Iwako take on the role of the principal again. Showing a willing expression, Iwako contemplated the idea and with a twisted expression agreed, saying it wouldn't be a bad idea. Making a disgusted face, he added that it had been some time since he last tortured someone and promised to generously repay Yoichi for the trouble caused by the student. As he cracked his knuckles, Yoichi responded in agreement, but was interrupted by the sudden ringing of the telephone. Noticing the ringing, Akko instructed Yoichi that he would head over later. Yoi bowed and affirmed he would see Iwako there. After Yoi left, Iwako picked up the phone and answered with his name. On the other end, a beautiful woman responded flirtatiously, thanking him for choosing them during the previous day's bid. Recognizing the voice, Iwako sternly told her to drop the act. It was revealed that the woman was none other than Ruaki, who was shown standing in a room atop a tall building, speaking to Iwako over the phone. She continued the conversation playfully, mentioning their partnership and shared government subsidies. It was revealed that Ruoxi was a member of the Pentagram Saints and the CEO of the Rio Company. Iwako commented that she was still the same as ever and said he was busy requesting to discuss the matter another day. Rui questioned what business the principal of the academy, known for filling his own pockets, could possibly have. This remark angered AKO, who warned her to watch her mouth but quickly dropped the matter. He mentioned he was investigating a student with the Void attribute. Rui questioned the usefulness of such a failed attribute. Despite appearances, it was still a unique attribute and thus unpredictable. With a serious tone, he said anything could happen. Rux's expression turned mischievous as she recalled Koakro's time attribute magic. Mentioning it caused Iwako's expression to twist with annoyance, and he shouted at her not to speak about Koiro, claiming it sickened him. Ruaki, unbothered, pulled her phone away to muffle his scream and calmly noted he was still as short-tempered as ever. Turning serious, she added that she couldn't blame him, as Koiro's awakening had drastically shifted the balance of power among adventurers. With a giggle, Ruoxi ended the call by saying she would contact him again later. Iwako responded with a curt goodbye. After ending the call, he slammed the telephone down in frustration and muttered angrily, calling Ruxi a selfish fox. Rising from his chair, he began walking in anger, muttering that hearing that cursed name again had infuriated him. His expression grew dark as he contemplated that it was the perfect time to take out all his anger and torture the student. The scene shifted to a forest where Awako's shadow appeared near an abandoned warehouse. As he walked toward it, he wondered how he should torture the student with the void attribute. Unlocking the warehouse door, he thought of various methods. Perhaps waterboarding or ripping out nails while wearing a grotesque smile. Laughing to himself, he expressed his intention to unleash all the anger he had suppressed during Kokero's time, now directing it toward this new target. Opening the door with an air of authority, Awako sarcastically apologized for keeping Yoichi waiting. However, the warehouse was empty, filled only with torture tools. Confused, he questioned why no one was there. At that moment, Yoichi appeared behind him and attacked with a sword. Yet without turning around, Awako raised his hand and blocked the attack effortlessly. With a menacing tone, he remarked that Yoi had clearly underestimated him, likely due to the arrogance instilled by Ako's own praise. It was revealed that Yoichi was still under the effect of the protagonist's absolute hypnosis magic. Enraged, Yako questioned whether Yoichi seriously believed he could win. Gathering magic in his hand, Yako conjured golden chains and hurled them at Yoichi, binding him upside down. With Yoi restrained, Ako kicked him and declared that someone like him could never be his match. As Yoi crashed to the ground, Awako approached him, scolding him for making the wrong choice. Though Yoi attempted to speak, the chains prevented him. With a menacing tone, Iwako accused Yoi of ruining himself with foolish desires. At that moment, a voice echoed, mocking Iwako for still being an idiot. Shocked, Iwako turned around and demanded to know who was there. The protagonist revealed himself inside the warehouse, criticizing Iwako for his greed and foolishness. Enraged, Iwako shouted, asserting his authority as principal. But the protagonist calmly replied that the line about foolish desires sounded like a fitting self-introduction for Iwako. Iwako twitched with anger and yelled, demanding the protagonist's student number and vowing to expel him. However, the protagonist smiled, revealing his teeth, and advised Iwako to calm down. With a composed expression, he stated that he had finally arrived at this moment and suggested they take their time and have a private conversation. The protagonist mockingly addressed Iwako, asking if they could have a little chat. In response, Iwako grew furious, gathering magic power in his hand and angrily accusing the protagonist of making a fool of him. The magic power surrounding Iwako's hand began to affect the environment, causing the ground to tremble and erupt. As he clenched his glowing fist, he declared he would show the protagonist the immense gap in their strength. Behind him, a massive hand formed from soil emerged, and AKO proclaimed it to be an advanced earth attribute magic attack. The giant earthen hand mimicked a fist, and with a scowl, Uwoko asserted that there was no way a mere student could evade it. Signaling the attack with his hand, he commanded the spell to strike, shouting, "Die!" As he directed his hand toward the protagonist, the massive soul-formed hand surged forward, quickly closing the distance between them. A tremendous impact followed as the giant hand struck the ground where the protagonist had stood, causing an explosion. Iwako began to laugh maniacally, triumphantly, declaring that this was the consequence for a mere student who dared to defy him. In the aftermath, smoke filled the air, and the ground was devastated along with the abandoned warehouse. Iwako, grinning, asked himself if perhaps he had gone a bit too far. He mused about needing a new place to torture people as he had destroyed the warehouse. Though still unaware of the protagonist's identity, he decided to stick around to witness his death. Iwako pulled out a cloth from his jacket, turned away, and lamented how much of a nuisance the protagonist had been. He wiped the sweat off his face. At that moment, a looming shadow emerged from the ruins of the warehouse. Startled, Iwako looked on as the shadow walked toward him. It was the protagonist, completely unscathed, calmly repeating his earlier invitation for a chat. Seeing that the protagonist was unharmed, Iwako was shocked. He questioned how the protagonist could remain unscathed after being struck by his advanced magic, claiming no student had ever survived such a thing. Demanding answers, he furiously asked the protagonist to reveal his name. The protagonist chuckled and asked if that was truly Iwako. Then, with a menacing expression, he asked whether Iwako already knew him. Confused, Iwako exclaimed that he didn't recognize him and ordered him to stop playing games and state his name. In response, the protagonist feigned hurt, asking if Ako had truly forgotten him. He gave Iwako the same expression he once did in a past life. This triggered a reaction in Iwako, who began backing away in horror. Grabbing his head, he denied the possibility, insisting that the person he feared was definitely dead. Fear overtook O's expression. Addressing the protagonist with a curse, he continued bitterly. He claimed the protagonist must have seen the news report on TV that stated Masato Kaakuro was dead. While saying this, Iwako raised his hand and began channeling green wind magic. Stones swirled around within the vortex of wind, and Iwako shouted that Masato Kaakairo was already dead. Unmoved, the protagonist closed his eyes, sighed, and began walking toward Iwako. He calmly accused Iwako of always believing only what was convenient while ignoring the rest. Still unaffected, Iwako warned the protagonist to stop talking and threatened to strike if he came any closer. The protagonist smirked and acknowledged the situation. He then began to gather magic power in his own hand and accused Iwako of being swayed by sweet lies. With a deadly and intense expression, he added that this was why Iwako had betrayed him, Masato Kaio. At the mention of the name, Iwako lost control and hurled the green wind magic at the protagonist, screaming for him to shut up. The protagonist remained unshaken and channeled his own magic to counter the attack. In one powerful motion, he sliced magical assault in half with his bare hand, causing the energy to vanish. Iwako, in disbelief and despair, recognized the magic. It was the same as the one Kaio had used in the past. Images of Kaio flooded Iwako's mind. A powerful blast erupted to the side as the protagonist slashed through the magic. Iwako collapsed to his knees, muttering in denial. With a face full of despair, he insisted that Kaio had been sealed away. Meanwhile, the protagonist approached him, looming above the kneeling Ako, and coldly stated that he had been trapped and thrown into the depths of despair. Iwako, still rambling, asked in disbelief if the protagonist was really Masato Kawao. The protagonist knelt to Iwako's level and with a smile said it had taken him long enough to realize. He then greeted Iwako, saying it had been a while and that he was glad I remembered him. With despair evident on his face, Iwako questioned the protagonist, asking if he was Masato Kawakro. In the very next moment, Iwako stood up and shouting at the protagonist warned him not to take him for a fool. That would imply that Masato Koiro had died and returned to the world. His hand now swirling with green magic power. Iwako looked directly at the protagonist and remarked that Ghost should stay quiet. He then hurled a magic attack intended to kill, but the protagonist simply stepped back, effortlessly dodging all the incoming magic. Just then, the protagonist noticed something above him, a massive magic hand composed of soil descending with force to crush him, and it smashed down toward the ground. Yet again, the protagonist evaded the attack. Irritated, Iwako called the protagonist an insolent brat. Though inwardly, he acknowledged the need to gain the upper hand. He continued to reflect, admitting he might have been a non-combatant during his time as a Golden Seeker. Even now, the other Pentagram Saints mocked him for that. But clenching his fist, he reminded himself that it didn't mean he was weak. Green magic began swirling around him. The ground cracked beneath his feet and stones began to levitate. He announced that this was the secret technique he had spent 20 years creating. As the levitating stones shone with a yellowish light, a green wind magic, a wind attribute attack helped suspend them in midair. Iwako declared his attack as a dual magic combining wind and earth attributes. He yelled at the protagonist to take the full force of his technique and launched the combined magic with great power. The stones powered by wind magic acted like missiles, striking the ground with explosive impacts one after another. The force of the explosions was massive, and after the final blast, Iwako stood exhausted. As the magic around him dissipated, he asked how the protagonist liked that, claiming it to be his strongest magic. Iwako looked at the area of his attack where smoke lingered and assumed the protagonist wasn't retaliating. He chuckled, then spread his arms and started laughing triumphantly, proclaiming that he had finally defeated Masato Kawakiro. Clenching his fist, he praised himself and scoffed at the idea that Koiro thought he remained the same even after all those years. He dismissed Koiro's time attribute as a relic of the past, questioning how many years had passed. 20, he recalled. Iwako reaffirmed that he had changed, no longer the man Koiro once knew. He stated Kawakiro should never have underestimated him. Laughing proudly, he continued to boast that 20 years had made him stronger. His level had risen and it was only natural. He declared that he had finally taken Kawaro down and that he would no longer let the others act high and mighty. Referring to the Pentagram Saints, Iwako, with a devilish expression, proclaimed himself the true strongest among them. Just then, a voice echoed, asking if he was done. The sound of that voice left Iwako utterly terrified. The protagonist stood there completely unharmed, calmly dusting off his academy uniform. Iwako questioned in disbelief how the protagonist remained unscathed after all those attacks. The protagonist responded, acknowledging Iwako's ability to use powerful magic and even complimenting him as a hero of this era. Yet with a fake smile and aura surrounding him, he announced that now he could release his anger without holding back. Magic began gathering in the protagonist's hand as he formed a fist. Witnessing this, Iwako's expression turned pale, internally admitting that this man was a monster. But he also told himself that retreat wasn't an option. Not after everything he had endured to reach this point. He declared that he wouldn't allow the protagonist to mess with him again. Iwako raised his hand and conjured another giant hand of soil using his earth attribute magic, trying to grab the protagonist. The hand successfully enveloped him, and Iwako smiled, thinking he had caught him. However, the protagonist calmly coughed and sarcastically commented, My. It became clear that the protagonist had surrounded himself with water magic, preventing the soil hand from restraining him. He mocked Iwako for barking so loudly. Due to the water magic, the soil began to dissolve, and soon the mighty hand disintegrated completely. The protagonist asked if Iwako truly believed that was enough to defeat him. So, it appeared on Iwako's face as he frantically slashed his wind attribute magic toward the protagonist, shouting at him to stay away. But with a single sweep of his hand, the protagonist created a full-fledged wind hurricane that countered Iwako's attack. The storm was so intense that Iwako shielded himself, but he still ended up being hurled into a tree by the force of the wind. The protagonist, now charging fire magic, looked down on Iwako. Humbled, Iwako knelt before him, begging for forgiveness. He pleaded, apologizing for what had happened 20 years ago. He bowed deeply, hoping for mercy. The protagonist, however, simply stared with a blank expression. Iwako thought to himself that Kakairo had always been a foolishly kind man, and if he begged like this, surely he'd be forgiven. Yet, the protagonist's voice echoed coldly, commanding him to shut up. Confusion spread across Iwako's face. The protagonist continued, recalling how Iwako had trapped him back then by exploiting his kindness. With a menacing expression, he asked if Iwako really believed he'd let that happen again. On his knees, Iwako pleaded, reminding the protagonist that they used to be friends. The protagonist, unblinking and radiating menace, replied that Iwako had no right to speak those words, not after turning him into a demon of revenge. With his fist fully charged with fire magic, the protagonist slammed it into Iwako's face and continued to unleash a barrage of punches imbued with various magical attributes. Blood spilled from Iwako's mouth as he looked up and realized too late that he never should have messed with him. One particularly powerful punch caused a massive explosion, launching Iwako into a tree where he slammed his head. The protagonist calmly approached the now unconscious Iwako and remarked that he should be thankful for being spared. He stated he still had questions to ask, but observed that Iwako, now covered in ice crystals, couldn't hear him anymore, knocked out cold. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Please support this new content creator and please leave comments that will motivate me to do